I know you're very fond of Emily Dickinson, and I am too. She's one of the genuine geniuses in the American tradition and also in the Western tradition. There aren't actually all that many Americans that merit a place in the Western canon, but I think that she does, along with Herman Melville, Moby Dick, and a small number of other novels. She's the greatest American poet, I think. I think she's greater than Walt Whitman, who is relatively overrated. I think Emily Dickinson's economy in the use of words and her strange, quirky images, I've always found very attractive. So there aren't very many females whose work places them within the canon. Remember that it's in part a question of intellectual back and forth and intellectual influence. Now, Emily Dickinson was, the crazy lady in the attic. She wasn't having much back and forth, but posthumously, I think that every 20th century poet, at least in the U.S., is indebted to her, but also burdened by her, anxiety of influence. She's so good that it's like it's like being an Irish novelist. Joyce looms heavily over you. And if you're an American poet, the lovely gem-like brilliance of Emily Dickinson is hard to shrug off. In some ways, the very long, complicated poems of other American or Anglo-American poets in the 20th century is a way of just moving in a different direction, because her influence in the short epigrammatic poems that she writes is so profound. So I think that's part of the attraction for somebody like T.S. Eliot, writing very long poems. Yeats, of course, goes his own way, and I don't think that because he's Irish, I don't think that he has the same burden of debt to Emily Dickinson. On the other hand, I would say somebody like Wallace Stevens is always writing with a sense of indebtedness to the tradition, and particularly the American tradition that's exemplified by, or the high point of which is Emily Dickinson. Wallace Stevens' work is some of the most beautiful and nuanced work you're ever going to meet or you're ever going to read. If you ever get a chance, one of my favorites is The Anecdote of the Jar, which is about order and chaos. It's one of my favorite poems, and it is enigmatic and requires a lot of thought, but the nuance and delicacy of touch of Wallace Stevens is a very strange thing to find in someone who was the vice president, if I'm correctly informed, of an insurance company. You wouldn't expect someone with such a prosaic job to be a poet, but somehow he balanced those two things out. That's a very American sort of contradiction in its own way. Yeats, I think, is a master that few can compete with. I mean, if you like 20th century poetry, and I do, Yeats' version of Irish, or rather of English, the kind of Irish English, is an extremely musical version, which lends itself to poetry. The only thing that I would think is comparable is something like Jamaican English, and that's why that also lends itself to poetry. Things like reggae, all right? The Irish version of English is a very lilting, sing-song kind of English. It lends itself to meter, and there's a sort of music in it that's easily, or not easily, but is accessible by the best kind of poet. The brilliance and beauty of Yeats is, I think, not undercut by the fact that he believed various kinds of nutty things about the world. But regardless, as long as he continued to produce I mean, some of the most haunting poems of the 20th century. I can't take anything away from them. So if you know The Second Coming, right? Turning and turning, the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece, but it's also deeply concerning because what rough beast, its hours come round at last, now slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Good God, what is our age pregnant with? So he's a bit of a seer and a bit of a prophet, and to be fair, the greatest poets always are. Someone once said that poets are the unelected legislators of the world. And that's true because they create the images in our head. They create the stories we tell ourselves. And we believe them regardless of whether they get enforced because we enforce them ourselves. So, in a way, if you want real power over a nation, write its myths, write its poems and its stories, and then let anybody else who wants to write its laws. Legislation is in vain compared to the power of poetry. So I'd be inclined to say that if you get the chance, and I hope that you and I perhaps this summer will, honey, I would like to teach you William Blake. He's one of the greatest and most powerful of the English language poets, and he's a romantic, and he's also a visionary and a seer, and he's also mildly crazy. He's able to draw as well as write poetry, and his songs of innocence and experience are among the most beautiful things ever written in the English language. Right. Little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Gave thee life and bade thee feed by the field and o'er the mead. Gave thee clothing of delight, softest clothing, woolly bright. Isn't that a lovely kind of romantic, woolly bright little cloud of a beast cruising along the meadow? And that's the first generation of romanticism. Second generation, the little lamb turns into Moby Dick and kills Ahab. All right, that shows that we got to find something else to do. Romanticism is over by that point. Just to come back, another great 20th century poet that I, can't recommend strongly enough would be Auden. I love W.H. Auden's work. Sometimes he really hits marks of genius, and one of the greatest and most underestimated of his works is the Christmas Oratorio, and his song of Herod. Remember, Herod is the one who murders the innocents. He splices that together with the plight of the liberal technocrat and the things that you have to do when you submit to that utilitarian calculation. And it's one of the most brilliant send-ups of rational good intention. Also, Auden's, there's so many that I'm very fond of, but his very funny poem about Freud, I forget the specific lines, but I do remember it said, look, much of this is absurd, but like it or not, he's telling us stories that we all believe. And the other one was as I walked out one morning, walking down Bristol Street, I don't remember the details anymore.
It's okay.
But that's one of the most powerful and beautiful and moving elegies about time and the power of time. So Auden, I think, is often underestimated. And, Eliot is very highfalutin, and of course, Four Quartets is probably the greatest long poem of the 20th century. And it contains one of the very few Kantian jokes in the history of the world. Remember that Eliot was studying philosophy before he dropped out of Harvard and went and started writing very serious, self-conscious, Anglo-American royalist poems. He said in one of the four quartets, I think it's in Dry Salvages, the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. The idea, of course, being...
Yeah, I wouldn't have caught it.
That's going to go over everybody's head, except people who have a background in philosophy. What he's saying is, look, the roses didn't look red or blue because, well, that's the Humean empirical view. Instead, the roses had the look of flowers that are looked at. The a priori forms of human cognition are constructing the rose and mediating between you and the rose. So the roses turned out to have the look of flowers that are looked at.
There are a few people who make Kantian jokes.
Well, yeah, I mean, T.S. Eliot is one of them. That's a very serious kind of joke.
And you're the second one.
Well, no, that's the only Kantian joke that I'm familiar with, and I had to point out that it was there. There are so many interesting reflections on the nature of the soul in Eliot that, for all his quirky Anglophilia, he had an undoubted poetic capacity, and he was extremely talented. So I would say Yeats for his wild rose beauty, Eliot for his intellectual beauty, Wallace Stevens for his nuance, and Emily Dickinson for her astonishing collection of small but flawless jewels. These are my favorite poets. Oh, and I can't, of course, leave out Auden. I'm sorry for ignoring that, but these are the people that I read with great pleasure and profit. We'll toss in William Blake, and then if you keep me talking, and we and I free associate, I can tell you the various other poets I like from the ancient and the medieval era, but I think this is okay for now. Yeah. These are a few modern poets that I think very highly of.
And Lewis Carroll as well.
Well, Lewis Carroll, yeah, I mean,
he has a time and a place.
Yeah, but you can tell the people the truth that when you were growing up, one of the things that you perhaps didn't realize was unusual, was the fact that I had memorized all of Lewis Carroll's nonsense poems. Mm-hmm. And because I knew them by heart, I used to tell them to you girls, and I don't think you know them by heart, but I think you would recognize them by heart.
I would recognize the Hunting of the Jabberwock. I do have the Hunting of the Snark still memorized. I still have it.
Yeah, well, I remember, I memorized it one time before my memory became Swiss cheese. Yeah. I memorized them all. And so I would say, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves, to gyre and gimble and wave, all mimsy where the burrow grows and the mome wraths out grave. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Beware the jump bird, and shun the frumious bandersnatch." I can give you the rest, but you get to...
I know. You would make a good voice actor.
Yeah, well, there's nothing left to me but a voice now, so I'm glad to be able to do something. But on the whole, I'm glad that we got a chance to talk a little bit about poetry, and I'd like to do some with you when we get a chance in summer.
I would love to.
It's a kind of an acquired taste, and you have to learn how to read it. You have to earn your understanding of the only poetry that's worthwhile. Any poem you understand the first time you read it is not worth reading a second time. Okay?